declarations of interests and dispensations. Are there any additional declarations, members, that are already recorded in the paper? Thank you. Item 3 is membership of the subcommittee. Can we note the membership and the chairing arrangements for the year? Agreed. Thank you. Item 4, terms of reference. Can we note the subcommittee's terms of reference? Agreed. Item 5, can we note the standing delegation? Agreed. Item 6, can we note the minutes of the meeting on the 21st of March? Agreed. Thank you very much. Item 7 is a summary list of actions, and can we note that report? Noted. Okay, item 8, which is the main item of business for today. Can I welcome Luke Webster, who is the GLA Group Treasury and Investment Chief Investment Officer. Luke has to leave by 2:45, so if we could be relatively succinct with our questions, that would be good. And Rickardo Hyatt, who is the Senior Area Manager of Housing and Land at the GLA. Welcome to both of you, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Purpose of the meeting really is, your part of the meeting is to have a look at the land fund, what it's used for, how it's going, etc., etc. So I'll ask the opening question to both of you, which is a generic scene setter really, which is what is the role of the fund? Luke, would you like to start?
The role of the fund. So this is an opportunity to use some of the GLA's balance sheet strength, so effectively the cash that we have awaiting deployment, to rather more actively than we might have in the past stimulate some housing projects. So normally this is money that my team would be managing as part of its general Treasury operations, which, as you'll be familiar from other meetings, centre around capital preservation as our primary objective, and adequate liquidity to meet the GLA's operational needs. And that typically means that we end up with a very risk-averse position. But what we've noted is that over recent years, the GLA's funding position has improved considerably in terms of average liquidity. And that means that there's an opportunity to use some of that money in a more ambitious way. And what we've agreed with the housing team is that because we're obviously taking a bit more risk here, that risk to corporate balances will be underwritten by the housing budget, but we will use the money to potentially start some projects that we wouldn't otherwise have been able to do. We think that that's a win for everybody concerned, and assuming that all of our risk management works as planned and we're achieving the necessary returns to protect ourselves from any projects which don't achieve the results that we want, then we'll end up in a situation where taxpayers' money is earning more than it otherwise would, and we've been able to do more towards our housing programme than we otherwise would.
Okay. Rickardo, the Homes for Londoners team has grown as a result of this. What will the new resource deliver that wasn't there before?
So through the land fund, so taking a step back, we have our standard affordable housing grant programs, and we have been a grant giver for many years. So in terms of the added value of the land fund, we are proposing to become a bit more interventionist in the land market, to go beyond being a passive grant giver, to help to unlock affordable housing in areas and on sites which otherwise wouldn't come forward. So you mentioned that we have grown. In addition to that, we have refocused our resources and the roles of the teams to put a heavy focus on this work.
My fault, I should have reminded you and everyone to turn off their electronic devices again. Fine, Karen.
Mm-hmm. So we have refocused our resources, the resources and the time of the team, to look for these opportunities for us to invest where we can seek to make a return, but also to discharge the Mayor's statutory duties around affordable housing delivery.
Okay. Over what period of time do you think that the fund is going to bear fruit?
So we are the whole purpose of the fund. So the fund will be a revolving pot of money. So initially, we will be seeking investment opportunities that can bring us delivery up to 2022, in line with the settlement and the targets that we've agreed with central government. But in addition to that, and on the point of the fund being a revolving mechanism, we want to develop a long-term pipeline, an infinite pipeline if possible, of further affordable housing delivery in the long term.
Okay. I mean, Luke said earlier on that there's risk involved in that, and we are going to explore some of that in subsequent questions. We do need to talk about process and governance, and Assemblymember Copley is going to lead for us on that.
Yeah, can I just ask, first of all, is this something that's going to be mainly aimed at private developers or housing associations, or a bit of both, in terms of who the land is going to be then sold on to?
So it will be aimed at both. I think we have long-standing relationships with housing associations through our standard grant programme. And this fund, in part, will act as an additional layer on top of that to help them to unlock sites that are a bit more difficult to bring to market, that might require a bit more of a significant intervention from the mayor outside of the standard affordable housing grant programme. It gives us an opportunity to invest grant a bit more flexibly and at an earlier stage to give developers and housing associations a bit more certainty.
Sorry, could I just, just on that point, because it's a phrase that you've used a couple of times, land that might be more difficult to bring to development. And you've used the phrase significant intervention by the mayor. You've used that a couple of times. Yeah. Can you give an example of what you mean?
So, in terms of land acquisition, so there might be opportunities, for example, where we have one of our strategic housing partners, a housing association, who owns a piece of land, who is seeking to bring forward a development comprising a certain level of affordable housing, but there may be an adjacent site that they could acquire that is a bit more difficult, where with the GLA support and the mayor's intervention, they could have assistance to acquire that site and bring forward more homes.
Financial assistance, would you mean soft power, leaning on people?
So it's a combination of things. So I think obviously the land fund gives us powers to invest. In addition to that, we have made an offer to the sector and to our partners to be able to broker relationships with our local authority partners, to be able to broker relationships with TfL and other members of the GLA family, to be able to broker relationships with central government departments where we have existing relationships, and to bring partners together where that additional value can be demonstrated. So it's a range of
Would you not be able to do that without the land fund? Isn't that what you do anyway?
We would, but having this additional fund focusing on this specific purpose, helps us to go that bit further. So just going back to our standard affordable housing grant programme, we've secured a record level of funding from central government, and there are certain parameters attached to that, where we have to fund specific affordable housing tenures. Now, I think having a specific land fund or carving out a specific pot of money does allow us to do to apply our funding a bit more strategically than we otherwise would have been able to through the standard affordable housing grant programme. So you're right that we could do that anyway, but I think having those additional levers will help us to demonstrate and deliver that bit more.
Similar copy, my apologies.
That's okay, thank you. How are you going to ensure that where you've got obviously the idea is this gets around developer land banks, how are you going to make sure that developers don't then land bank the land from the land fund? Are you going to have development agreements? Are you going to be taking it through planning yourselves?
No, that is not the intention. Although, for proposals that come through to an investment committee, we will be looking at disposal strategies on a case-by-case basis. However, as part of the condition of us investing the land fund, we will be looking for quick, speedy delivery. So we wouldn't be entering into an arrangement where, the likelihood of land being banked, we'd have to mitigate that risk, but the likelihood of land being banked, that isn't why we'd get involved. So, we'd always seek to mitigate that. And in fact, our intervention, we'd be looking to have the opposite effect, to ensure that land is brought forward more quickly.
Can you guarantee that it won't be then just land bank when it's
contractually we would, absolutely.
Excellent. So just moving on to the process and governance side, whose role is it first to identify the land that requires intervention and second to handle the negotiations?
So there's a two-pronged approach that we're adopting within the Homes for Londoners team. So as I mentioned earlier, we do have long-standing relationships with our housing association partners. So we have sort of briefed them on the types of funding and interventions we can offer. And so there is an opportunity for them to bring forward proposals to us.
To you.
They can come to us and, we undertake due diligence as we would in the normal way and assess those opportunities. In addition to that, I think our separate approach will be for the Homes for Londoners team to look at a variety of information readily available in the market, different data sets, focusing on specific areas, namely opportunity areas identified by the GLA and the London Plan, and seeing where there are opportunities for us to invest and acquire land or unlock delivery in a different way. So it's.
Will there be a sort of particular focus on public sector? I don't want to talk specifically about St Anne's because Jeanette's got some questions on that. But I mean, is there going to be a particular focus on identifying areas where other parts of the public sector are going to be selling?
Yes. So again, we are working very closely with local authorities in London, and in addition to sort of recent publication of our funding prospectus, aimed at councils, aimed at getting councils to deliver homes directly. Part of that conversation is where we can go that bit further and work in partnership. In addition to that, we're having ongoing conversations with central government departments, and we're trying to get to a situation where they want to dispose of surplus public sector land, that the GLA is the first call that they make. And we are articulating a specific offer to ensure that they get the outcomes they're seeking, and as do we for Londoners.
Excellent. And Luke, who's responsible firstly for challenging the investment proposals, and secondly for actually approving the spend?
So the investment committee is an organisation we've set up to fulfil that purpose. It's formally an organ of GLAP, which would be the funding body for the majority of these projects. And that's composed of a mixture of, there are some independent members, there's myself representing effectively the GLA's corporate interest, and then the housing team representatives too. So the Homes for Londoners team, working in an interdisciplinary way with members of the financial services and group finance team, supported by external advisors, will prepare papers for the committee to consider. The committee will conduct that challenge exercise, and then we will proceed on a unanimous basis.
So who approves the spending?
The committee.
The committee who actually approves it.
Yeah, and technically there will be an ADD or a DD done to conclude the process. But
one clarificatory point. You said on a unanimous basis, so if one dissenting opinion, it doesn't get carried.
That's the expectation, yes.
Okay. Has that been tested yet?
Yeah, we haven't. St Anne's is the only project that's gone through the process yet.
I appreciate it's early days. Yeah. Sorry,
that's quite all right. And what are the main guiding principles of this investment strategy? Is there a sort of list of criteria that will be applied?
Yes, we're developing that further at the moment, and are expecting to finalise it imminently. But effectively, the purpose of the various controls are to ensure that the GLA does get its cash back when it needs it. So it's important to remember that this isn't sort of new funding. It's financing in effect. It's a way of paying for things, but actually these projects have to pay for themselves overall, and that's the revolving point that Rickardo was mentioning. So we have limits on how long money can be committed, and so a small proportion of the fund may be invested beyond 5 years, but the rest would then be expected to come back earlier, so that we maintain a balanced approach. Likewise, the balance of risk between different projects has to be balanced to keep the overall risk within the portfolio at a level that we're sure that in the worst case, if things went wrong, the housing budget could sustain. And similarly, we'd have other limits on concentration to individual projects and so forth. So there are almost two tiers of scrutiny going on. One is making sure that an individual project makes sense and it's something that will deliver some benefits and will reasonably be expected to deliver a commercial return, or by which I mean a return that's appropriate to the level of risk of that project. But then we're also looking at the overall portfolio position and making sure that the GLA's balances and liquidity are protected.
And the criteria you mentioned, will that be something that's publicly available?
Yes, it will.
That we can see. Excellent. And in terms of, you talked about when we're going to get this money back, what balance are you aiming to strike, or is the fund aiming to strike between short, medium and long-term land holdings? Have you got a view on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think we would hope that the majority of the money would return within 5 years.
Yeah.
Exactly, and then to the extent that a profit has been made, that profit would be available for longer term investment subsequently. And once the ideal situation would be that the fund would fully renew itself over time, and the return that we've generated on projects will create a permanent investment fund that will be
that will grow.
Exactly. I think that is then when the endeavour becomes truly additive, because that will be new money that we can commit potentially for much longer periods of time. And provided that we exercise the discipline in selecting projects that are commercially viable, it may well be the case that we're able to attract co-investment from the private sector or other public sector bodies, and that sort of, in a sense, lever that money and unlock larger or more projects.
How big is the risk that the opposite happens?
That
you lose money?
That we lose money. I'd say corporately there's none if the risk management works effectively, because we're ensuring that we're not taking any more risk than the housing budget is prepared to underwrite. But as more projects develop, I'll be able to answer that question more precisely. But it's important to note there will be some risk of loss. This is not risk-free. But what we're saying is that the budgetary impact to the GLA's non-housing activities will be eliminated.
Why was a new investment committee established to oversee the fund rather than using the Homes for Londoners Board or the Corporate Investment Board?
I think this is a specialist area, and we needed to create a committee that was resourced and constituted in the right way to consider commercial investment decisions. So it was decided that it made sense to involve me and my team's set of expertise, and also to involve some independent perspective.
And just finally, just in relation to these changes that are being made, which allow the Executive Director of Housing essentially decision-making power with no financial limit, I think what's being proposed. Is that power delegated to the right level, and is it necessary?
It's necessary to be able to take these decisions quickly, because it may be the case that some of the opportunities need a very agile response from the committee in order to catch the opportunity. So I think it is a reasonable thing to do to delegate the expenditure within the context of the fund to an executive director, and really the GLA in so doing is placing a level of reliance on the committee's effectiveness to exclude projects that introduce undue risk.
The committee essentially is gatekeeping, so the committee makes the decision.
That's right.
And the executive director, as chair of the committee, signs off the fund.
That's right, yeah. So the delegation is part of the necessary integration of the investment committee process with the GLA's general scheme of delegation.
And that presumably that would be seen by the Deputy Mayor for Housing before
That's
it was
right.
signed off anyway.
Who's also a member
Yes.
of the committee.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, we're going to move on and talk about the investment we have made, which is St Anne's. We've been holding off until now. So Member Arnold is
Yes,
leading
Chair, thank you. My questions will be about the St Anne's investment, which I understand it is the fund's first investment. It was announced in May 2018, and that was for the site currently used by St Anne's Hospital in the London Borough of Haringey. So just for the record, Rickardo, just tell us a little bit about the partners and the sort of the backstory, because you told us about you were looking for a story where intervention, added value, and all that was. So what was, in brief, what was the backstory here?
So we entered discussions with the local mental health trust in Haringey, I think at the end of 2017, with a proposition to acquire the site. And one of the main sort of drivers for the GLA to intervene in this instance is, so the previous proposals to redevelop the site would have only yielded, I think, somewhere in the region of 12% affordable housing. So, and that was the proposal that was on the table was something that the local community weren't entirely on board with. And we believe that it didn't demonstrate and reflect the potential and capacity that the site could accommodate. So it was felt that we would invest land fund money to acquire the site to not only increase the level of affordable housing from 12% to 50%, but to also allow the local community to have input and so that their views could be reflected in the development that's brought forward. So overall, at the moment, we are proposing that the development which comes forward delivers up to 800 homes, 50% of which would be affordable. And in addition to that, and aside from the housing outcome, as part of the deal that we've done with the Trust, there will be a number of homes that are provided for workers of the Trust. And with some of the receipt that that is yielded from the purchase, that they get from the purchase, from selling the site, they will be able to deliver a brand new state-of-the-art facility on an adjacent site. So, you know, it was clear to us that, you know, going back to my point on, you know, using the mayor's powers and funding to add value, it was a clear case where we were making a difference.
And my briefing tells me it's the size of about half the size of St James Park, so a significant plot. Is that the analogy you would use in terms of
Half the size of St.
It's difficult to envisage St James Park full stop, isn't it?
Yeah.
Like, is it the size of a football ground?
Yes.
You know what football ground looks
Yeah.
like. It's about the size.
It is a significant site.
Yeah.
And I think the key thing to note is, of the entirety, we are only acquiring about 2/3 of the Trust holdings.
Right.
So I think the element that we are acquiring, you know, we believe could accommodate up to 800 homes, which is, I think you're right, thinking of an analogy, it's probably, I don't want to get drawn into analogies, but it's probably roughly the size of a football pitch.
No, I know the site well.
Right, okay.
I used to operate there as a nurse many years
right.
ago. And then you're going to, I mean, just to get to the overview as well, I understand that the working with the GLA will allow the Trust to be able then to carry on services on site. So there will still be health services because
absolutely.
of this transferring of monies around the place.
Yes.
Yeah. And so here's the thing. You're going to use GLA fund to buy the property. Then you're going to then sell it on
Yes.
to housing associations and another developer. Why couldn't you have brokered that deal and let the housing association and the developer get in there and get on with it?
So again, there's the risk there that we wouldn't have been able to get to 50% affordable housing.
So that was a driving factor.
That was one of the drivers.
Yeah.
But in addition to that, you know, having undertaken our due diligence, we believe that, you know, there is a potential here for this investment to make a return, not only in the social benefit, but subject to going through a competitive process of disposing of that piece of land, that, you know, effectively the GLA could recoup its investment. But that obviously, you know, we've done our due diligence, we believe that could happen, but the site still needs to be taken to market.
That's good. And look, can I just ask you about the monies now? In terms of, are we saying that you paid about £40 million for the site? Or for the
yes,
two-thirds
that's
of the
around
site?
the quantum, yeah.
Yeah. So I'm told that in 2015 the estimated value of residential site with planning permission in Haringey was 10.4 million per hectare. So does that make a good deal for us?
Having seen the cash flow projections for the project, anticipating the disposals that Rickardo has referred to housing associations further down the line, we were convinced as a committee that there was a reasonable prospect of the site paying for itself, and coupled with the very significant additional social benefits that have been identified, it was therefore an appropriate project.
Okay, and there's been some delay, because I understand that you were hoping to go for planning permission. I might have lost it somewhere. Let me ask the open question. Are you on track in terms of your timeline within this 5-year envelope that you've talked about? Because if you've lost a year because of delays, you're not going to be within your 5-year envelope, are you?
Yes, that's an excellent question in terms of how we manage this, because and that's one of the reasons why we will seek to limit the size of individual investments, and where possible try and attract additional investors to share that risk, because in the instance of a sizable investment like this one, approaching 20% of the portfolio, any delays to this project will have a big impact overall. So what will happen is this is a project that we'll monitor extremely closely, and if there are delays that look like our expected receipts are going to be pushed back, that will affect the way the committee approves subsequent projects, and therefore will give preference to things that will return money sooner, and potentially say no to projects that have longer term horizons, so that we maintain the average behaviour of the portfolio within our limits.
Because this is the first, clearly you'll have to capture learning.
Yes, that's right.
Again, from our investigations, we found out that the fund did not have a strategic investment strategy in place when it embarked on acquiring this land. Are we right?
That's correct. The overall framework was not finalised, but we've taken the view that firstly the project was of a size that the housing budget could underwrite it in the way that I described, so that it didn't pose a direct risk to the wider corporate activities of the GLA. Secondly, there's the opportunity that with having a first project in place, that allows you then to calibrate the framework for subsequent investments to ensure that the overall result is one that's appropriate.
Yeah.
So I think it's an example of the opportunity to acquire the site was a short-lived one, and it required a quick action. So we decided on the balance of risk that it was an appropriate thing to do. Had the project been larger, I perhaps wouldn't have been able to sign off on it from a corporate perspective. But at this scale, it was something that we felt we could manage.
Yeah. And of course, in the future, you will have, the fund will have its strategic plan in place.
Indeed.
And you will have taken a lot of learning from
That's
this
right.
whole experience. The because it's borders on my constituency, so I know a lot about what's happening. What if you run into a fact that you're wanting to work with a developer and local residents don't like that developer? Because that's happened recently.
Rickardo, perhaps you want to-
So
You know what I'm talking about.
yeah, so up front, I think I mentioned earlier that there are issues in the previous proposals not reflecting or taking, having due regard to the local community's aspirations for the site. So this time round, with our involvement, we are working very closely with the St Anne's Trust, START, and we have in effect entered into a memorandum of understanding where we will manage their engagement and their input into the project throughout as proposals are developed, all through the procurement phase to identify a development partner, through the planning phase to ensure that we marry up their aspirations with our own, and to deliver the greater benefit for the area.
That's a key piece of learning, isn't it?
It is.
Because that's caused quite a bit of problems. To Luke again, how did the review and challenge process work? I mean, you've alluded to it, but it was quite risky, wasn't it? Because you didn't have this agreed investment strategy. So just talk us through it. I mean, what was the political involvement? Who did you have to get the sign-off for? Just take us through the processes.
We may have shared this question, because I suppose my interaction with it was focused to the investment committee process, and certainly we provided what I view as a robust challenge there in terms of asking for visibility of all of the project financials and context on the feasibility of the planned disposals. I think I'm conscious that some of the details of the transaction are commercially sensitive, so if there's more detail, I'll be very happy to provide that in writing. But I think it's fair to say that this is at the extreme end of the risk spectrum that we would view as acceptable. So my expectation is that subsequent projects will have a slightly different risk and return balance. But nevertheless, because of the underwrite that we'd agreed with the housing team, we felt that this was something that could be contained. The benefits were very clear and very significant, and on the balance of those wider rewards and the potential impacts on our financial position, we felt that it was appropriate. But it was certainly not something that was nodded through. There was a robust challenge process.
And if I could add to that, I think in terms of the expertise within the Homes for Londoners team and those who sit on the investment committee have extensive experience of these types of acquisitions of surplus public sector land, including hospitals. So under the previous administration, there are a number of hospital sites that had been acquired that we had successfully taken to market that are currently under construction or have completed altogether. So in terms of mitigating the risk of the type of investment, we were confident in the fact that we've brought forward these types of developments before on these kinds of sites.
Good. And just last couple questions, because again I've highlighted that a major risk is that you go outside the 5-year time period. So just tell me about the proposed 3 phases and the dates linked to that, because I understand you're going to have, you are envisaging a 3 to 6 months after purchase, and then whatever else was to happen, because your end date was 2023. So have you extended that timeline now to 2024?
I'll give the project-specific responses to Rickardo, but I just wanted to make clear beforehand that that 5-year figure that I mentioned is an overall portfolio average target. So some elements will trail beyond that, and we'll just have to offset them with things maturing earlier if that's the case.
Okay, so can we get on record that the current timeline that you're working to, Rickardo, for this project?
Yeah, so in terms of this particular project, the proposal is to take the site to the market by the end of this calendar year. However, once a development partner is on board, there are elements that are out of our control, i.e. the planning process and the level of consultation that is required. However, given a project of this scale, typically, we would expect a start on site to be achieved, within the...
Let me finish.
Oh, sorry, there was a
Sorry. Within the next sort of 3 years. But that would be subject to the planning process and the developers programme. In terms of completion of construction altogether, as I'm sure you'll appreciate, there are uncertainties laying ahead for the economy generally and for the housing sector in particular. So we will have to manage those risks. But we would expect that the project would come forward in a timely fashion. But I'm happy to provide further detail on our programme separately.
Before my colleague comes in, can I just follow up and say, because you bought it with planning permission for X, so is that now a full, a sort of starting from scratch planning application or amended?
So given that we are going to have to procure a development partner to re-look at the site, and given the additionality that we're trying to bring forward on the site, I think it would require a revised application.
Right.
A new application, sorry. So, obviously that would have to be taken into account with regards to the delivery programme.
So,
thank you. Just a few questions on that. So, when this deal was announced, the Mayor said this would mean guaranteed 50% affordable housing. How are you going, if you're not taking it through planning, how are you going to make sure that, given that viability trumps everything, how are you going to make sure that commitment that's been made is honoured?
So that will be a contractual commitment.
Contractual commitment, excellent. And are you going to do any? Are you going to have a contractual commitment on the 10-year blend within that, or is that going to be up to planning?
So we will work closely with Haringey to ensure that the mix of affordable housing that is delivered is appropriate for the local area.
But it won't be a contractual thing. It's going to be. Yeah.
So we have to go through the procurement process, and the local authority will be consulted and will be heavily involved in that. In terms of whether it falls to being a contractual commitment, I think that will be dictated by the conversations that we have with the local authority.
And apologies, sir, I appreciate we're on budget, not housing, but I know you're straying slightly.
No, we won't stray.
Can I just ask, it is, I think it is relevant, I believe you'll be working with the Community Land Trust, is that right, on some of the affordable housing?
So the local community group, as I mentioned earlier, they will be heavily involved in the proposals as they're developed. I think at this moment in time, ahead of the procurement process, I wouldn't want to go into specifics.
That's fine.
No,
I'm just veering us straight back to budgets before I finish.
Move on to your...
And I'll move on to my question as well.
Before you do that, I need to ask one question.
Can I just ask about...
Can I just say that Luke is with us for another 5 minutes, and the next section is very important.
Before, can I just say, could we, through letter, just get back the names of the members of the investment committee, and because I don't think we've got that. But
that's in the brief.
Oh, is that in the brief? I didn't see it. So if we've got that, that was the only thing that was outstanding for me.
Thank you. I want to ask just quickly to Luke about the because I believe that the hospital or the NHS Trust is going to be leasing back some of the land. Is the revenue from that going back into the land fund, or is it going elsewhere?
My understanding of the revenues from the project in terms of what the fund receives are linked to disposals.
Yeah.
I'm not aware of
that's
lease revenue.
Yeah, that's correct.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. So, back onto my next question. Hopefully we can go through these quite quickly, given the time. I think the first one, you've sort of answered. The first one is how long will it take for the fund to become a revolving facility? Is the aim for just within 5 years? Is that the aim?
Yeah, we would hope to see receipts coming in hopefully sooner than that. And really this comes back to the sort of central role of the committee. As Rickardo's mentioned, there are significant uncertainties with these kind of projects and when cash flows will arrive. So probably the greater part of the committee's job is, once we have 3 or 4 projects underway, is actually monitoring those and adapting the parameters for future investments to make sure that we get the right result overall, because nobody can forecast these things precisely. So ongoing monitoring and adjustment of future behaviour is really the key task.
And will the fund spend all the initial £250 million before the end of the mayoral term, and will that be enough to meet the fund's objectives?
Allocated?
That would certainly seem plausible to me. Again, it would depend on the pipeline, and the committee obviously has as its overarching objective the fulfilment of the financial criteria that I've outlined. So if suitable projects come, then yes, but we will have to maintain discipline, and if projects are not suitable, then they won't be allowed to proceed.
Yeah, so you're not just going to spend it for the sake of spending
exactly.
it.
So these are corporate balances, so they need to be protected.
Okay, and will the fund have a separate ring-fenced account, and how will this appear in quarterly reports?
I don't think we've necessarily agreed that in terms of how this committee receives reports. So I'm very happy to work with financial services colleagues to agree that. But certainly the investment committee will be keeping track of the fund's activities, and it will be viewed as in a ring-fenced way, so that we're able to attribute the returns to the right place.
I mean, emerging planning policy in the London Plan places an emphasis on small sites and developing small sites. Will the fund prioritise smaller sites in the investment strategy in line with that, or is the aim going to be for sort of medium to large sites?
I'll start. So, we're not putting a limit or threshold on what the fund will support. We'll consider every proposal that comes forward on its own merits. So if there is a smaller site that we could support that will unlock numbers of affordable housing, then we will certainly do that. If it's a larger site, then again, we'll take it on its own merits.
Do you have what sort of relationship do you have with the TfL development team? Because I would have thought there was, I thought at some point the fund might be able to be used to unlock a larger development, alongside perhaps a TfL site. Is that something that you envisage, and are you having those conversations?
Yes.
Great.
We're potential.
Excellent.
Yeah, very much. We're also having conversations with a range of other public sector and private sector investors, because that.
Okay. Thank you, gentlemen. Thank you very much. That brings us to the conclusion of this section of the agenda. Members, can we note the report of today's discussion?
Noted.
Thank you very much.
Both now free to go.
Yes.
Good luck.
But, we will pause the meeting briefly while we rearrange the room, and Luke will leave us. Marvellous timing.
Cheers, and we can just get on with the work. Really good, isn't it?
GLA, Committee Room 5, Sound. 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 GLA,
Exactly.
We are reconvening with item 9, which is the second main item on the agenda today, which is to look at the Young Londoners Fund and MOPAC. I'd like to welcome our guests for this session. We have Siobhan Peters, the Chief Finance Officer at MOPAC, Sarah Wilkins, the Senior Education and Youth Manager at the GLA, and Lynne Abrams, the Senior Programme Manager North for the GLA. Welcome to all of you. Thank you very much for your time. I understand that, Sarah, you need to leave around about 3:10. Is that
No,
correct?
it's okay. It's been cancelled.
Oh, marvellous.
As rearranged.
Okay, good. We won't rush our questions with you then.
You might just need to clarify Lynne's job title.
Have I got it wrong?
It's recently changed, so apologies, I should have notified the committee. It's Senior Policy and Commissioning Manager.
In MOPAC.
In MOPAC.
You know what?
Policy and Commissioning Manager in MOPAC.
Right, thank you very much for the clarification. We will make sure we tidy up our records.
What we've got.
Okay, so we're going to be looking at the Young Londoners Fund. As is traditional, it's generally quite an open question to start off with, which I'll ask Sarah initially, which is what the purpose of the Young Londoners Fund is and how it fits in with the mayor's priorities. So scene setting question for you.
Young Londoners Fund was announced back in February 2018, and it was in the context where we've seen obviously a national rise in serious youth violence, and also over the last several years we've seen significant cuts in youth services for young people. So it's thinking very much about how we can focus on prevention and support young people so they don't turn to get involved in crime and criminal activity. So the fund itself is a £45 million fund in total, of which £30 million we've recently gone out to ask for applications from local community organisations and other to bid to deliver projects to support 10 to 21-year-olds. And those 10 to 21-year-olds can either be young people who are at risk of getting involved in criminal activities or risk of exclusion, or they can be those who have already been involved in criminal activities.
Okay. And how do the MOPAC programmes receiving money from the fund contribute to the fund's aims?
So there are 4 projects that have been in receipt of the initial £15 million, or part of the initial £15 million uplift of the fund. These are the London Gang Exit Service, the expansion of youth work from major trauma centres into accident and emergency departments, the Mayor's London Needs You Alive campaign, which is a media campaign, and finally the Knife Crime Community Seed Fund, all of which are targeted towards young people in that kind of demographic who are either at risk of or involved in criminality.
Are there any KPIs assigned with that funding? So any expected outcomes and dates that are assigned with it?
Yes, there are some outcomes broadly in relation to things like reductions in victimisation and offending, in particular for the interventions like London Gang Exit and the accident and emergency youth work. For the London Needs You Alive campaign, there's a broader kind of scope around looking at reach and communication to young people. There's also a toolkit that's recently been launched that supports the dissemination of the London Needs You Alive campaign, so that's targeted towards schools, youth groups, community groups and faith groups, which is intended to help practitioners work with young people to get those messages across and help get them engaged. And finally, for the Knife Crime Community Seed funding, there are 43 different projects within that funding across various different London boroughs, some of which are focused on things like parental support, some of which are focused on things like support for bereaved families, some of which are focused around engagement of young people, either in positive activities or with mentors, police officers, leaders. So there's a range of different kind of project aims and outcomes that relate to those different projects.
Okay. I'm going to get into that in a little bit more detail a bit later on, but rather than steal my own thunder for later on in the meeting, I'm going to pass on now to talk about the applicants and access, and Assemblymember Arnold is leading on that first.
Yes. First question to Sarah. Sarah, we'll start with you. We have noticed of the key criteria and restrictions. So we have those on records. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 bullet points that we've got. And of the applicants so far, can you tell us what percentage met, if you like, those 9 criteria?
Is that under the who can apply for the fund?
Yeah.
So the application consisted of a number of gateway questions, and then there were scored questions. So the gateway questions tended to be those ones which fit under the 9. So applicants did have to say yes to that to be able to continue with their application. So it was kind of an initial sift to make sure that they'd be eligible for the fund criteria. The closing date was on Monday. So the applications have just come in. Now, of those applications which have come in, we're doing the kind of initial eligibility check. I expect the vast majority would have met those criteria because they would have been very unlikely to have continued to the scored questions if they'd been saying no to those gateway questions.
Right.
So it should already have kind of been at that initial stage where people wouldn't have carried on doing their applications if they didn't meet some of those criteria. Of course, some people may, and that's why we're doing a double check against things like the one about the turnover, for example.
Thank you. And so, just looking at it, you talked about, if you like, being really local. I know some charities that are really local, doing some good stuff, that may not have been able to answer yes to all those gateway questions. And they are local on estates with a known population. How do you justify excluding them?
I think what we wanted to get a balance, because we wanted to make sure that we were investing in projects which did have a track record and did have experience of working with the client group, and that they could show that through their application forms. And we also wanted to make sure that they were financially stable organisations, which were meaning that they weren't relying 100% on the Young Londoners Fund grant. So thinking about the future sustainability and the legacy of the project, we wanted to make sure that grant holders had a mix of funding, which is why we set the criteria about having no more than 50% of your turnover constituting your annual grant amount. And actually that is a considerable concession in what the GLA usually uses with its due diligence. So they usually say no more than 25%, for example, of the grant compared to the turnover. So we've recognised that we do want to have smaller organisations bidding, but that they won't always meet those conditions. There's several ways that we've been looking to see what we can do to support those smallest organisations. One is that they can work in partnership with other organisations, so that a lead partner can put in and can take the responsibility for the grant, and they can become part of that partnership. And we made that clear in the frequently asked questions about the fund, that that's a possibility. We also stated in response to questions in frequently asked questions that what can happen is that the lead applicant could actually be saying, what we're going to do is run a micro grants programme. So again, they take the responsibility for the overall grant, and they could be supporting and nurturing some of those smallest organisations so that they could, in a way, be best fit to actually apply for the main fund next year when it reopens this time next year. The other things that we put in place to support the smallest organisations is through the Impact for Youth part of Young Londoners Fund. So through the scale-up funding, we've got allocation of funding where we're going to be providing wraparound services to those organisations who are delivering Young Londoners Fund, but also funding to provide more funding to local networks of youth organisations so that they can provide support to grassroots organisations who didn't apply this year to the fund but may want to be applying next year to the fund.
So what does that mean? What does that look like then?
So what we're planning through Impact for Youth is to fund approximately 15 local networks across the capital, so providing additional funding where there's already infrastructure in place to support youth organisations. And a part of the responsibility of what we want those networks to do is to look to see how can they support those smaller organisations in their patch, either to band together in the way that we just said, or to understand what is the right level of grant that you can apply for. The final thing on this is we've been directing people to other grants which the GLA manages. For example, the Culture Seeds grant, which is for very small, very new organisations. So we've made clear in all of our information sessions that we've been holding that this isn't the only option for people looking for funding. There's other things which are funded either through the GLA or through other organisations.
So as far as you're concerned, that would then meet the information that we have, that about 39% of charities nationally have less than £10,000 that they're working on, the really local. It is these micro charities that are around the very areas, social services, culture, and youth engagement and recreation. So having recognised that, you're saying that's why you've got the additional networking response, and also signposting what else there is. Right. So are you saying? So you're saying that basically there should be no complaints because you're saying you've covered every avenue.
I'd love to say we've covered every avenue. I think we've made every effort to make sure that people can be involved. And you know, the third option is about joining a consortium or joining as part of a partnership of other organisations so that they can band together to provide services which really wrap around the young person and the individual.
That's great. And just lastly, one of the great things about, say, the London Fund, you can go online and you can see who they're giving their money to. You can see if it's in your locality, what the expectations are. Will you be doing that with this fund?
We'll certainly be publicising who's recipients of the fund, and we want to make that as easy as possible, not only for stakeholders like ourselves, but also for young people and for people who work with young people, so they know what's available in their local area.
But saying what the expectation of that money is for, because it would be half the information. If you go on and you see somebody's received the fund and you don't know what they should be doing,
we'd certainly be giving details about what they would be delivering, so the kind of activities that they would be delivering.
Yeah.
I'm unsure about whether we'd be publishing their targets. It's not something that we normally do, but I can take that back and consider about whether that would be something we'd want to do.
Okay. As long as there's as much information there as possible, that would be useful. And then a question to MOPAC. How does MOPAC manage the risks associated with partnering with grassroots organisations? But are you taking the risk? Because isn't it a GLA issue? I don't understand what the MOPAC risk would be.
So for the work that we're doing with the seed funding and the small organisations, we're working through the London Community Foundation because they have a successful track record in administering this kind of small grant programme, working with small charities.
So you do the seed funding?
So the seed funding, right. And those again are generally small grants. We will keep in touch with, and we are offering a range of ways to do some capacity building with those organisations through the year, so that we kind of keep our finger on the pulse, if you like, of what's happening with those organisations. But we have got a professional organisation between us and them, so that MOPAC, as a fairly small body, is not trying to track on a quarterly or monthly basis what's happening in a range of small community organisations who themselves are not set up to work with a body like that. So we're working through an organisation that's got skills and experience in running small grant funding.
And is Red Thread the only organisation you work with for the seed funding, or are there other organisations?
You're welcome to clarify that. So just to clarify, so the seed funding through the Young Londoners Fund is going towards 43 very small community organisations. That list of 43 has been published, including where they're based and what their kind of targets and aims are in terms of who they're working with and for what purpose. Some of the other programmes of work that sit under the Young Londoners Fund and MOPAC funding are things like
youth work in major trauma centres, which is currently delivered by Red Thread, St Giles and Solace. But also planning to expand that into accident and emergency departments, and that has yet to be commissioned, so we wouldn't know yet who would be delivering that.
Is there sort of like a targeted area? You knew what you wanted from these organisations and then asked them to bid, so that you knew what you were expecting.
For the Community Seed Fund?
Yes.
For the Community Seed Fund, it was a very open process. It was across London.
Yeah.
There were limitations, for example, in relation to who could bid. So we were looking for some of the small organisations, small community and local organisations that you referred to earlier. We wanted to make sure that we were supporting and sustaining small organisations with very local expertise to access funding. So it was quite broad and quite open. We had quite an excessive amount of bids into that fund. So we originally had £250,000 available. We were fortunate to be in receipt of some of the Young Londoners Fund to enable us to uplift that offer. So we were able to focus on a broader range of projects, but still thinking about the areas in London which were most significantly affected by knife crime.
Okay. And when will you see any outcome? I'm not going to go into outcome now, but what's the timeline in terms of getting feedback, some evaluative feedback?
It is different for each of the different chunks of the funding that we're handling. So for the work with the very small organisations, the funding has been given largely upfront because these are tiny organisations, as you say, that can't carry the cash flow, and they will be reporting back, and there'll be a comprehensive report on that at the end of the year. For the expansion of work from the work we already fund in major trauma centres, but the expansion into A&E has to go through a proper commissioning process, and so we won't start to see activity until towards the end of this year, and therefore evaluation much further down the line. For the London Needs You Alive campaign, we're monitoring in real time the kind of reach of that campaign and the newer elements, the toolkit and so on, which have just gone live. It's so early days that it's too early to comment on that, but we will be monitoring that sort of week by week, month by month, going through the next few months.
So in total then, my last question, how much money have we just talked about? Sarah, how much money are you spending? Are you giving as a funder?
So there's a split. So there's 15 million which has been allocated for various scale-up activities, of which a certain amount of that's already been committed and then we have 30 million for the main community fund, which 15 million went out in the first round. So that's the one which is just closed, and then we're intending to allocate the further 15 million of that fund this time next year.
Right. And MOPAC funding on this area?
So we have, from that 15 million, we've received a certain amount of that. We've received...
Like how much?
So we've got 2.5 million in this financial year, in 18-19, which is split as around 1.1 million for the community seed funding, roughly another 1.1 million for the two larger projects, London Gang Exit and the youth work in A&E, and then 185,000 which goes to uplift the funding that we had already put into the London Needs Your Life campaign. Some of that funding we expect to carry on into 1920, so the two major projects we already know, we expect to carry on that funding for a second year. That makes it easier and more practical to commission on that scale. But for the seed funds, we don't yet have plans in place for what we would expect to see next year, and that's something for discussion with Sarah and the GLA more broadly about how we learn from and go forward with seed funding.
Well, thank you for that. Certainly, that's quite a lot of very good information we now have on the record, and of course, because this is public, it's out there for people who have questions about the fund, how it's going. And then thanks Sarah for confirming that you will be looking at a system that will make knowledge of these programs much more accessible than previously, where people have tried to find information and couldn't. I mean, that applies equally to MOPAC. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, I saw something about O'Connell.
Yeah, sorry, I think it might have been linked to, because I see you've got the last set of sections outcomes anyway, Chair, so it may be part of that, but I wanted to I fully understand the amount allocated to MOPAC, it's in 3.6, which is your share of this year's 15, and I understand that completely. I also understand about the community seas, because that's an opportunity to get the money out rather quickly out the door, I think, from to small groups, usually under the auspice of a larger organisation. So I think within Croydon it's the BME Forum, I think from memory, who then will be the conduit to control that. And I'll ask a question later about how you judge the outcomes of those smaller groups, because they are under the umbrella of there's a name for it here.
Community Forum.
Yeah, what do you call it? The only question was on the full amount of the 45 billion, 3 times 15, 3.6 you've got, because I've been talking to Matthew Ryder's office, because much of that, and this is what you've said, isn't it? Much of that funding under this fund is also going through the integration cohesion piece, isn't it? Which is through the auspice of not MOPAC, but Matthew Ryder's. Have I got that right?
Yeah, there's a number of different...
I don't know the whole list of them, but that is all right. My understanding is correct, isn't it?
Yeah, so there's 3 million which has been allocated to Sport Unite's funding, and actually $500,000 of that was included in the round that we've just finished from the main fund. And then there's also funding which is going to additional support for Young London Inspired, which is under Matthew's team, Head Start Active.
That will probably be for another day for this group, because they will probably get Matthew Ryder's team here to talk about all the work that they're doing. But I just wanted to understand, this is the 3.6 of MOPAC, which is either over 1 year, which is the seeds funding, or 2 years the others. The seeds funding you've pretty much got out there, but the other ones, the bids are just closed, and you're looking at those bids at the moment for particularly the trauma centres, which is the Red Thread and others, because I know you're looking at the hospitals involved, and you can't announce that yet, and I'm aware of that. I'll wait to get to the outcomes piece, Chair, which is the next set.
Thank you very much for that. We are now moving on to exactly that.
I'm good at this.
You are very good at this. We can swap if you like.
No, I'm a guest. Thank you for inviting me as well.
Well, thank you for the summary.
So, how does MOPAC monitor? We touched on this slightly at the beginning, didn't we? How do you monitor the outcomes for the funding that you are dispensing?
If you take it project by project, I'll add anything.
Just focusing on the uplift of the 4 projects that I mentioned earlier. For London Gang Exit, there's a full process and impact evaluation that's in place through our evidence and insight unit. So they are looking at the data across the individuals that are going through the programme, what kind of impact that's having in terms of their criminality, in terms of victimisation. Interim findings from that evaluation process are that there are reductions in both general offending and violent offending, as well as victimisation for that cohort, which is sort of early positive signs.
How is that assessed? I mean, in simplistic terms, SMART targets are things that everyone understands. What you're describing may or may not be eligible for SMART targets. So how are you assessing that?
So the evidence and insight team are able to access both information about the young people who are on the programme, but also things like MPS data or Met Police data, which establishes whether or not they have reoffended. So we're able to cross-reference young people who've gone through the programme and then establish whether or not they've been stabbed, shot, been a victim of any other crime, as well as whether or not they've been involved in criminality. So we do have quite a robust way of assessing that, but as I say, it's interim findings at the moment, so it's still relatively...
So that's for the LGE? That's
London Gang Exit. For the major trauma centre work with Red Thread, there's an ongoing process of monitoring. I should just say, just coming back to London Gang Exit, there's quarterly contract management meetings and monitoring forms that go to inform those. Similarly, that's the case for Red Thread, St Giles and Solace, who, as a sort of group, provide the youth services within the major trauma centres. So we undertake quarterly contract monitoring with those and receive information about who's receiving the service. We've been working with Red Thread in particular for some time to look at the impact of that. There are some really positive findings in terms of the level of risk that young people both pose and feel that is towards them in terms of the risk towards them from other people having gone into a major trauma centre, having been a victim of violent crime, presumably. So there is some work underway around evaluating the major trauma centres, and we will be working around the expansion of the A&E programme to think about how we build an evaluation from the beginning as well. We've already talked, I think, about the community seed funding process, so I won't go into that too much. And as Siobhan said, in terms of the London Leaves You Alive campaign, we are looking at that on a regular basis, thinking about how many times it's been downloaded, accessed, shared, and so looking at the broader reach. We will be doing the same for the toolkit as well.
And we are particularly interested, as you might imagine, by the London Gang Exit and the Red Thread programmes. Do you set them targets?
Yes, yeah. There are sort of outcomes which we want them to achieve in relation to things like reduced offending or decreased risk to the public or to themselves or to others. We have softer targets around things like retaining involvement in education or employment, making sure that we're providing things like broader wellbeing support through mental health initiatives and that kind of thing. So we do have a range of outcomes that we're asking them to achieve, and in particular with the London Gang Exit Service, there's a PBR element to their contract, so they are sort of financially being rewarded for meeting those outcomes.
Okay, I mean, do you challenge them and set service improvement suggestions, or offer the service improvement suggestions?
Through the quarterly contract management meetings, not only do we review the monitoring returns, so the throughput of individuals through the service, but we also look at emerging themes, trends, issues and challenges, where there are things like the emergence of, for example, challenges around accessing medical services, mental health, developments in terms of violent crime like county lines or young people being exploited criminally. We will work with the London Gang Exit Service to ensure that they're responding in an agile fashion to the needs of the cohort that are accessing the service.
What about Red Thread? I mean, Red Thread's more health and social care, isn't it, rather than criminal justice. How well equipped is MOPAC to challenge them and suggest service improvements to them?
So the function of the service that they provide, whilst they're based in a health setting, is very much around youth work and mentoring and support to access other kind of services. So obviously, in particular, when you're looking at the major trauma centres, the young people who are in that space are going through clinical interventions and sort of medical interventions. The function and purpose of getting that youth work in there is to make the best use of that teachable moment, which we're all familiar with in terms of being able to make a relationship with that young person and use that entrance into the major trauma centre to help support a change process in the longer term. So they are engaging with that young person in relation to things like mentoring support and youth work and encouragement to retain involvement in education or employment, rather than necessarily looking at the medical interventions or the social care interventions, which will also be provided, but which MOPAC don't commission.
So how are you monitoring organisations like Red Thread to make sure that they are spending the money that you provide them and getting the best outcome from it?
I mentioned the quarterly monitoring returns. Those look at both the service itself, but also the spend against the budget of the service. So, for example, if there's an underspend in a particular area, we will interrogate why that is, explore whether it could be utilised elsewhere, and so on. So we do look at their spend as well as the service provision.
Sure. Okay, the final question for me, and then I've seen Assembly Member Arnold. I understand you're currently looking for match funding for the local London Gang Exit funding. Have you been successful in doing that?
We were originally in conversations with the London CRC, Community Rehabilitation Company, who in the first round of funding, so from 2015 to 2017, they provided both some match funding in terms of a financial contribution, but also some funding in kind through staffing contributions. They've been unable to retain their financial contribution, but do provide a seconded employee from the London CRC to support that. There's also seconded employees from the Department for Work and Pensions and some other sort of organisations that go in to form that multi-agency response. So most of the conversations that we've been having around match have been around in-kind support and staffing support as opposed to financial contributions.
Okay. Does that cause you any concern?
The staffing contributions?
Well, no, the lack of any financial match funding. I appreciate what you're saying about in-kind contribution. The lack of any financial contribution for match funding, does that cause you any concern?
I think that it would be really wonderful if there was a mixed model of funding. I think that one of the positive things about doing a really comprehensive process of evaluation is that we're starting to be able to demonstrate the impact of that service, and I think hopefully that will help partners to come on board.
Okay. Assembly Member Arnold.
Yes, Chair. It's just how do you extract outcomes specifically for your fund to a project like this when the individuals may well be getting support from other agencies? Like you made this statement, which is a lovely statement. You said 46% of young people supported had seen a reduced involvement in crime. How can you be certain that this is specifically to do with, this was in relation to Red Thread's work?
In terms of attributing it to that particular intervention, I mean, certainly that's a real challenge, I think, across evaluations of all projects. It can be very difficult to isolate the intervention of one particular project and ascribe outcomes or behaviours.
So how have you tried to meet that challenge?
So it's a complex cohort, it's a complex challenge in any field, because we do both process and impact evaluation. The impact evaluation, of course, is the result of all of the interventions that young person has come across. The process evaluation gives a much stronger indication of how those involved in delivering and those involved in receiving a particular intervention felt. So it's subjective, but it is their opinion of the extent to which that intervention was instrumental for them in helping them with their journey. And we have some very positive feedback from some of those interview work with people who've received the interventions, that they felt that that particular intervention has been a supportive part of their journey to a better outcome. But you're right, of course, none of us is an island. Some people receive a lot of help and some people don't get enough.
No, I mean, it's an ongoing issue, isn't it?
Yes. It's a very complex field, working with some people in very complex circumstances.
So you would put that caveat then?
We would always put a caveat.
In terms of all the statements that you make?
We would always put a caveat on the extent to which this kind of evaluation can only give you an indication of your success. It can't give you such an absolute answer.
Yeah, thanks for that.
Okay, well, it's very early days, isn't it, for this fund? Yeah. It's established this year for 3 years, and we've been going for, 6 months. So I think we will probably invite you back in maybe another 6 months or maybe a bit longer, and ask similar questions again and see what answers we get. We've reached the end of our questions. Can I thank you all very much indeed for your attendance and for the answers that you have given. Members, can we note the reports?
Yes,
agreed. We'll wrap through this fairly quickly, so hopefully you need to storm out just too quickly. Item 10, members. This relates to the Q4 17-18 GLA monitoring reports. As mentioned in the pre-meeting, the Mayor's budget guidance for 18-19 included a commitment to ensure quarterly monitoring reports are issued after 35 working days of quarter end, and that deadline has come and gone. So I'm craving your indulgence to write to the Mayor's Chief of Staff in consultation with Party Group leads and Caroline Pigeon to raise this point. Is that
agreed? Agreed.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Item 11 is the Mayor's decision list from the 9th of February 2018 to the 7th of June. Can we note the report?
Agreed.
Agreed.
Item 12, payments over £250. Can we note that report?
Noted.
Noted.
Item 13 is date of the next meeting, which is the 17th of October 2018 at 2:30 in this room.
Yeah.
Item 14, any other urgent business, or business that I consider to be urgent? There's only one thing that I would like to say. It's coming home.
It's coming.
That's the end of the meeting.
We agree. Unanimous agreement.
GLA, Committee Room 5, Sound. GLA, Committee Room